Please welcome the panel on Is This India's Moment? Moderated by Dean of the School of Business at George Washington University, Anuj Srivastava.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So the title of this session is This India's Moment. To me, as a professor, that means that could have an answer of yes, no, or maybe. So it'll be a short conversation. Therefore, I will take some questions. And if you want to keep running it, please go ahead and submit questions, and we'll try to adjust to that as well. But I am absolutely delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists here. Praveen Agarwal, co-founder and group CEO, Better Place, a global tech leader and part of many technology startups. Tanvi Badan, Senior Fellow, Foreign Policy, the Brookings Institution, and an author of many publications on India's foreign policy. Vineet Mittal, Chairman, Avada Group, and a social entrepreneur and a pioneer for clean energy who has been conferred with the Solar Man of the Year title on 2 occasions. And Anuj Srivastava, co-founder and CEO, Livspace, Asia's largest home renovations and interiors platform unicorn, and an investor in over 150 companies. His name is Anuj, I just realized, and so is mine. This is going to be a confusing thing, whether I'll be answering questions or asking questions. But in case you like the answers, please be confused, and that'll be fine.
As long as I get the credit, Anuj.
Well, I don't know. This is going to be a game now. So let the game be on. But before we start with some deep questions here, I want all panelists to answer in 30 seconds. One word that comes to mind on why this is India's moment, and perhaps one word that comes to mind which may put a pause to why this is India's moment. Let's start with you.
I think the one that comes in my mind is size and speed. If you look at, this is not reflective of India's population now, but we are 1.4 billion people now and growing even faster than China. But keeping that aside, I think what is important is to see how the economy looks like, right? We are 3.5 trillion economy. China is
30 seconds, my friend. 30 seconds
China
for the first question.
17 trillion economy, and we have the opportunity to grow really fast to that 17 trillion economy, right? And if you look at the speed at which we are growing with respect to unicorns, we had 100 unicorns last year, right? And that's the speed at which we are executing. So I strongly believe it's the size of the opportunity as well as the speed at which we're executing.
Great.
So if you gave me one word for opportunity, I would say confluence. So confluence, if you gave me a sentence, I'd make that India is facing or has a confluence of favorable geopolitical, economic, demographic, energy, technology, digital trends right now. So I think that's the opportunity. The challenge, the one word I'd use is delivery, which is can India take advantage sufficiently and at sufficient speed to take advantage of this window of opportunity that exists for it?
Great. Vineet?
Golden lion as what India should be and India is. And in terms of opportunity is gender diversity and inclusive growth.
Great. And about you, Anuj?
I kind of agree that this is sort of India's moment, and I think largely because it's like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And I think I like the word confluence. There are many things that are actually going right for that country in terms of income demographic, age demographic, advent of technology, respect for entrepreneurship, so forth and so on. I think what keeps me up at night and the challenge would be sometimes actually, I've sort of used that word with a lot of love and humor, is that we don't want to sort of snatch defeat from the jaws of victory because the opportunity is there for us. But if we fail in execution, while this might be sort of India's decade and century to come, it would never be the destiny that it is actually looking ahead for.
Well, thank you. Based on the timing, you've all kind of done it in 30 seconds, which I'm really proud of moderating now, that it kept to that time. So, we'll go deeper into each one of these things as we go through the whole panel today. But I want to hear about some unique characteristics of India. Unique characteristics of India where it has, in terms of business or societal patterns, which would help from India from making this mark and seizing this moment. There are so many CNN and New York Times and all kinds of Western media which is talking about India's decade just in the last week. So it's a very timely conversation to have. But what are some of the unique societal and business characteristics and patterns that India has, which will make it successful?
I mean, look at, for example, the size itself, right? 3.5 trillion economy, growing to 7.5 trillion economy by 2031. If you look at the amount of consumption, the local consumption which is happening, it's doubling to 4.2 trillion roughly by 2030 to 2031. The amount of infrastructure getting built in India, the number of ports, the roads, the railway stations, the airports, everything is actually in the right direction, right? On the other hand, if you look at 1.4 billion people today, we can look at the challenge with that, but I personally believe 25% of the working population in the world could be from India. And this is the moment where we can upscale the population for the world and not only focusing only in India, right? And that's kind of going to create massive change.
So you mentioned this, and Vineet, I want to ask you this next question. You know, there was this question that confluence that Tanvi had raised about whether or not we will, as India will realize its full potential. So, you know, we looked at it a few years ago, a few decades ago, where China was in a similar situation, and it was able to do that, perhaps because of the political system being different. Would the political system in India, being a democracy, slow it down, or is it just set up right now for it to be able to realize its full potential?
So I would say that India historically used to be called Golden Bird, Sone ki Chidiya. So the reason it got invaded so many times because of the wealth and resources it used to have. And as per the British historian in 1700 AD, India was almost 25% of the world economy. And due to their practices and due to their rule, we were where we are today. But in the last 3 decades, what has happened is India has started realizing its own potential again. And we had a period of self-doubt, and a lot of Indians who left India early and proven their mental at various parts of the world kind of inspired rest of the India to unleash the abundance. And if you look at, if I had to answer the professor's first question, India will be about IT. And by IT, I don't mean information technology alone, but it's about Indian talent. So what India is good at is that it has talent based across every aspect of business, humanities, culture, politics, you name it. Indian peoples are in every walk of life across the world. And the other thing which is unique about India is India has never invaded anyone. India has not breached its boundary. And the reason I called it Golden Lion right now is that it has potential to reach and become the golden bird again for the world. But it won't be a bird, it will be a lion, where whether using cybersecurity or any kind of modern technology, people won't be able to breach the boundaries. So India is becoming self-reliant, whether it is on the defense, whether it's on manufacturing, whether it's on agriculture, whether it's on infrastructure. We build 40 kilometers road a day. Which other country does it? I met someone 2 days back here at the dinner, and she was mentioning she moved 40 years back, and she was talking about a town and how long it used to take her from going to one town to another town. And I happened to cross the same area. What used to take her day now currently takes 2 hours. So India is becoming efficient. India is becoming self-reliant. Fortunately, 80% of almost production is consumed locally. So we are not per se dependent on other countries to make food for us or make infrastructure for us. What we lacked was the capital, which now world is making us attractive. During COVID also, we attracted $85 billion in a single year. What India attracted since independence was around 900 odd billion. But what we have attracted in the 7 years is more than 500 billion. So once you have that kind of equity flowing into the country, and if you are able to leverage it 5 times, 2.5 trillion of external money, added up with the almost 32% saving rates of local economy, what you are talking is that whatever we dream and visualize, we would be able to achieve. And with the digital penetration, what has happened is India has created a benchmark. We have almost 700 internet user using handheld devices. We have 5G connectivity into the remotest part of the country. I used to be in the IT field, and in 2000 when we started supporting Microsoft from India, to take a 2 Mbps lease line, it used to take 3 to 6 months. And even in the US to data center, the connectivity used to take 3 months. And now in Indian home, like at my home, now I have multiple 100 Mbps line, dedicated point to point at the fraction of the cost. Probably the charge of your yearly mobile rental is equivalent to the lease line. So the whole cost structure has been broken. If you look at the maximum digital transaction, financial transactions are happening in India, almost 3 times of the China, and the cost is almost negligible. Now India is building a platform where every shopkeeper can open their own Amazon free of cost. Everything is made available by the government as a environment as well as a platform. So UPI, which is now becoming a tool which many other countries have started using, has become a very efficient tool for payment processing, payment gateways. And if you look at the same thing on the other aspect, one of the areas where we needed to conquer was the education, that we have 30 odd million people coming out of universities and schools and colleges, but almost 50% of them were not employable. So when we used to hire them, we used to train them for 6 months before they can do productive work. And what the current government did is when they did the industry consultation session, they realized that's a major weakness we have, and unless they fix it, India is not going to be able to transform. And they have rewritten the entire education policy, looking at best practices from Finland to all the best parts of the world, as well as dipping into our ancient culture of Gurukul system, where the whole concept was experiential learning. So if you look at education, enabler is telecom and IT, and at the cost where the poorest of poor can afford it. And on top of that, fairness and corruption-free society. So with the internet and IT, what has happened is that if I need my passport, I will probably get in 3 days if I pay $25. If I stay in the queue, probably in 15 days. Very transparent process. Earlier, even to get a passport issued, it used to take few months, and you had to give at least $20 in bribes. So actually, the whole game is changing. Indians, by and large, have started rewarding any political party which is clean, transparent, honest, IT-enabled. And the good news is that at the rural area, by providing the connectivity and wireless access, so we didn't had almost 50% of India connected with the wireline, and now everything is on Wi-Fi. Yeah. And the Wi-Fi also, where you will get 10 Mbps plus at the remotest part. And the best news is, in the last decade, when I started in energy business, I wanted to do energy because I thought God has blessed me and let me do something for society. And energy is inversely proportional to poverty. And 350 million people had no access to electricity. And this I am talking about 2010. And today, every willing house is connected to the grid. Every willing person has 24/7 electricity. And farmers are getting electricity throughout the country for free.
So, Vineet, this is great. Now, we'll come back to many of these
Just
points in there, but go ahead.
I think Vineet answered all the questions about India. One thing he missed out is that with the China Plus One happening, right, there's manufacturing is also playing a huge role, right? If you look at Foxconn is starting, India is the largest, second largest manufacturer of mobile phone. Air India, the Tata Group ordered Airbus, now 465 of those. There's a large manufacturing happening. So when you're thinking about India as an opportunity, think not only from IT point of view, which is brilliant and which is driving force, of course, but think from a manufacturing point of view as well, because that's the second largest driving force going to be. Today, 15% of GDP is manufacturing, is going to be 22% by 2030. So this is a huge opportunity for all of us.
Great. So, Tanvi, I want to actually come back to you. These are, they have taken us into very specific kind of things. But I want you to help us kind of like put a macro level, the geopolitical and the geoeconomic trends that you are observing, especially since you've written a lot about this. So can you frame that conversation on where that?
Sure, and I think it's related, including to the manufacturing and diversification discussion globally. But what's interesting is, I mean, you have this kind of secular trend of India wanting to transform economically, which you've had for the last 30 years, and Vineet described it. What has been happening, and that drove kind of India's international engagement. So you saw economic policy really driving kind of who India's partners were. That was a priority for foreign policymakers. Today, what you've been seeing, and this is akin to what you're seeing in various different countries, over the last few years, what you're really seeing is now kind of the geopolitics driving economic policy as well. Geopolitics plus COVID, and even COVID is seen from a geopolitical lens. We talk here a lot about US-China competition. What doesn't get as much attention is that India is in its own competition with China. 3 years ago, around this time, there was a fatal clash between the two countries. The China-India relations are at their lowest point since the two countries fought a war in 1962. What this has meant is, much like our conversation here in the US about what kind of economic engagement with China meant, in India too, what you're seeing is a discussion where you've gone from just about 10 years ago, or 7 or 8 years ago, where China and economic engagement was seen as largely an opportunity. It is now seen as a vulnerability, particularly in certain sectors. So one of the trends you're seeing is that India is going through, and I'll focus a little bit on this kind of economic security discussion around China, but there are other drivers of that as well. That includes kind of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fallout of that. It includes kind of COVID-era shortages, but also very specifically what was seen as the lack of transparency, and not just China, but other countries kind of becoming insular. So what you've seen largely is kind of an Indian economic security approach that actually echoes certain elements of what we see here, but also has some distinct elements that poses opportunities and challenges. And I'll leave that for if we have time, but largely what is India's kind of not decoupling, but de-risking or disentangling approach? And you really have seen that. And it has three elements. One is kind of limiting, and this is largely out of a concern of overexposure to China, of increased exposure to kind of Chinese influence in various aspects of society. So what you've seen is limiting and restricting or imposing extra scrutiny on certain kinds of Chinese investment and activities in various sectors: telecom, technology, investments, and even in kind of civil society and exchanges domains. Second, you've seen part of this approach is a reshoring or indigenization. And the third is kind of friendshoring or diversification. Just briefly, kind of that indigenization includes, and this is both because of a kind of a China-driven economic security approach, but also because India has wanted to manufacture more at home. And there is now, critics say, look, there are protectionist elements to this as well, but frankly, India does need to kind of increase that pie in its kind of mix of manufacturing. It is odd, whether it's in the defense industrial space, whether it is in kind of commercial space, it is odd that a country India's size and of its economy doesn't have a bigger manufacturing sector. So you'll see services continue, but there is really this drive in kind of the indigenization space. This is not just about Indian companies. The idea really has been to try to attract investment from and kind of alternate investment, alternate sources of capital, alternate sources of input, both to start producing it at home, but also to try to find kind of other and bring in other companies to invest in India, particularly in the manufacturing sector. What this has also meant from an opportunity point of view is that it's meant that the Modi government, which came in and was moving in a protectionist direction towards on trade, had increased import duties, is actually now rethinking trade, has signed some bilateral trade agreements with Australia, with UAE. It's negotiating with the EU. We're not interested here in trade these days, so not with the US, but if that opens up, potentially that as well. So you really are seeing in Canada. And then just very quickly, so you're seeing kind of this manufacturing space where India is trying to attract alternates and find different sources. Why does this matter to us here? Think about the pharmaceuticals we get. A majority of that, a big bulk, comes from India. a lot of their advanced pharmaceutical ingredients has come from China. It's 60 to 70%. So the idea is to make all of our supply chains resilient. India wants to bring that number down. At least it's not going to go to zero. Their trade numbers are still going up very much like ours are, but to try to kind of make that more resilient. And that comes to the third element, which is really diversification, which is both India itself trying to look for like-minded partners, and it's doing this through using kind of bilateral relationships like with the US, but also through kind of groups like the Quad, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the US, or kind of what I like to call the West Asia Quad or Middle East Quad, but is officially called I2U2, clearly a Star Wars fan there, which is India, Israel, US, UAE, which is focused on technology and kind of the agricultural food processing space. So really looking for alternate partners and trying to take advantage of other countries trying to diversify and find more resilient supply chains and protected critical infrastructure.
So that's great. Let me bring Anuj into this as well. Oh, that sounds strange when I call my own name out there. But Anuj, but both Praveen and Tanvi have mentioned the China plus one. How is that benefiting India, and is it? And you're talking about the relationships where like-minded countries are trying to be together. Right now, US and India are causing up to each other, right? So tell us a little bit more about that, and then I'll probably want a comment from both you, Praveen and Anuj, on this one. But I also think about follow-up to that. If you look at right now, US is not going to give up its pedestal as number one. It's not going to be easy for them to be able to just give it up to China. Now, right now, US and India are cozying up to each other, but some implications, both geopolitical and geoeconomic, on what happens when India is going to be projected to be number 3 economy in the world in 2 or 3 years. Will that be something which the geopolitics will change when that happens? And they'll be threatened by India's economics. So let's just start with that, Anuj, first.
Yeah, I'll probably kind of take off from all the other stuff that we were talking about. See, I think my personal observation, I kind of grew up in India, came here, so almost spent close to about a decade in California, really, working for Google, and sort of saw the rise of the internet, kind of economy and era, and chose to kind of go back to India and kind of the India-like territories in emerging Asia, which is really what my journey and my story is sort of all about. And observationally, I think I've seen sort of 2 big core trends emerging, which I think are really helping India and sort of places in the right quadrant. One is India as a destination, right? So the per capita consumption and per capita income will 2x, 3x, over a period of time. And while there is dramatic amount of acceleration happening across the economy, I personally am very excited about, sort of look at India, and if you can break it into kind of like the top 10, 15 cities, the next 50, the next 200, and everything else. And I've sort of seen that over the last 5 to 6, 7 years, what used to seem like an 8 to 10 city phenomena is actually today likely seeming like a 200 city phenomena. So that's interesting because availability, cheap technology, the fact that you actually today need lesser capital to be able to start new ideas and so forth and so on. Distribution networks are significantly efficient. Supply side investments have happened. So you can actually make a great quality product and service that was available at the right level and in the most trusted manner, not just to people living in the top 10 cities, but likely people who are going to live in the 150th and the 200th city. That's fantastic. Right? That's kind of new. So that opens up a huge opportunity for sort of Western and or other sort of formats of capital and resources and infrastructure and knowledge to be able to look at India as a very large opportunity. And the other observation I sort of made in the last 5, 6 years is that India is not a demand-constrained economy. India actually is a supply-constrained economy because these number of people in 200 cities and 250 cities and per capita income going up and people actually seeing consumption and consumption-led growth as a way to kind of go up in society. All of that is happening in India. Then it's sort of pretty interesting that the fact that if you today as an entrepreneur or as an infrastructure enabler are actually able to organize supply in the best manner possible, you actually likely have the power to actually provide the most trusted experience to the consumer. And that's actually very important a statement because in that case, what happens then is that the supply constrained infrastructure or environment that entrepreneurs are inheriting is likely giving a new playbook for the world, right? So India and India-like nations, which could include Southeast Asia or the Middle East, or eventually perhaps like Latin America or North Africa and so forth and so on, can actually likely follow the playbook that was actually created out of India. So my fervent belief and hope is that India will one day actually produce fantastic companies, fantastic ideas, great entrepreneurs, 50 to 100 such amazing ideas that will kind of cut across the planet, because that playbook never got created. So that's one. The second thing is that I think what you were talking about was that India actually, sort of China plus one, call it whatever you want to call it, but sort of India, Vietnam, maybe a little bit of Malaysia, of course, benefiting heavily from it. But I think what you have to look at India is not just a manufacturing destination. I think manufacturing is fantastic, and I'm hardly the expert in it, but I think a lot of sort of work is probably going there. But when I look at India, I think India is the largest place for sort of organized, human talent. In AI, in pharmaceutical molecules, in the B2B area. Of course, SaaS and so forth and so on has been available for like a few decades. But I believe that these very large, trained, young workforce that is available in India today could potentially actually become a significant source of B2B, India outwards driven innovation. I think sort of those two things are very, very powerful trends in my mind. And I think I'll sort of just take a minute to talk about the second question that you asked. See, India is a large economy, or India is a great economy, and India is a great state are two different things, right? So maybe that's where the clue lies, right? Because great nations are actually all about not only just economic power, but it's economic power, it's military influence, it's cultural influence, intellectual property influence, and so forth and so on. So how the world sort of wakes up to India as India starts exerting its influence and pressure and advent and examples and success in these areas, and you're actually then welcome to the party, will be India's sort of opportunity. But we'll all live and learn and watch and enjoy.
Great. Praveen, in fact, if you can also add to that the Global South, because he started hinting there, and the implications there.
I think that's a fantastic point. One, there's 2 points that I'll add on to what Anuj said. I'm part of G20 right now, and India is hosting it. And one of the things that we're working on is how do we help people mobilize and help mobility of people across the world, and India being the center of the gravity, right? And this is something which is very interesting because it's about helping organizations across the world. Talk about Australia. There's a now partnership between India and Australia to move to 200,000 people, or nurses and medical help and various different roles, right? IT being one of those for sure. The other thing which is very important is what has happened over the last years is 10 years back, it was all about taking a side, whether I'm on the side of Russia, I'm on the side of US, I'm on the side of China, this and that. But today, how India thinks is what's right for us as a country, right? How do we add value to our people? How do we increase the per capita? How do we increase the income? How do we decrease the poverty? And then finally, what can we do for the global, right? What can we do for Nepal, the neighbors, the outside world as well? And I think that brings parity in friendship, that brings parity in partnership. And that's a huge shift that has happened over the last few years. And I strongly believe this is where the game is also changing. Everyone has started looking at the partnership very differently than how they were looking at perhaps 10 years back.
Yeah. Vinny, may I go ahead?
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of get at your question about kind of what happens in 10, 20 years. I think it depends on how India grows, right? So if you see an India that is growing with the world, with these like-minded partners, why do we have concerns about China? It's not about China's growth per se or its power per se. It's its behavior. Whether in the economic field there is a sense, and it's not just in Washington, it is why TPP, the US is not part of TPP, people and societies feel it, which is that this was unfairly done, that there was a lack of reciprocity, etc. If there is a sense that India is growing and in a way that is, with all these other countries is adding value, it's not happening at the necessarily, there will be some expense, but not kind of, then yes. If you have an India that is not behaving assertively, invading other countries, pushing people around, if you have an India that continues to be connected, and India is, as much as we think about, if self-reliance is more about resilience rather than protectionism, and I think that's the spectrum, right? If it's not just about insular but open, and this is where then you don't see, after all, there was a power transition between Britain and America. And they didn't end up. And part of that was open societies and democracies. So both from an economic point of view and openness, technology, you have talent that is, Silicon Valley, look at it today, look at the leadership of a number of American companies, right? But even populated throughout. Semiconductors, where's a lot of the design taking place at American companies? Where's GE's second largest kind of research and development facility in the world? It's in India. So as long as it's kind of going along, add that openness in terms of economy, migration, those issues. And now these could be tough if the global environment. But the second thing is, this is where the fact that India is a democracy, has institutions, is open. So we see what's happening there. So one of the reasons, you see kind of this discussion of the good or bad, I actually think in the long term it's more stable, because they're not going to be the kind of surprises where you suddenly see, a Putin in a closed society deciding to invade another country, or down the line, we don't know when Xi Jinping makes that decision potentially vis-a-vis Taiwan. In India, we'll likely find out because the discussion is happening openly.
Great. So let me, very good points there, and I'm going to come back to Vineet because I had some question there to still tease out from your earlier remarks. You were talking about the golden bud and the golden lion and going from plant kingdom to animal kingdom, trying to confuse me, but I think I got everything that you were trying to say there. But you were talking about a huge amount of investment that is going into India right now, and as an entrepreneur, that investment is very important, but you're also mentioned of like-mindedness, taking care of relationships within the region. How do you see India's current, in that regionally, how do you see the tensions that are there impacting India? And there are other factors which are at play, and I would love to hear your thoughts on why that may be absolutely secondary to the main goal here. Things like the Adani scandal that happened, for example. Can those kind of things start to hurt the investment that is needed and is being diverted to India?
So I will share, so 2 years back I took a delegation to Bhutan because they don't measure GDP, they measure gross national happiness. And so I was chatting with the Prime Minister, he's a doctor, and he hosted us for dinner, and we were sitting and chatting. And he was saying that large part of their budget comes as a grant from India. And large part of their economy runs at the back of Indian consumer base. And their biggest source of revenue is hydropower, which is generated in Bhutan and goes and sells to India. And India provides them border protection and acts like a family member. So I would like to share, I'm an Indian and I've grown up praying. So our prayers are actually never for an individual. So we say actually in every house we are taught 3 prayers. First is Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, Sarve Santu Niramya, Sarve Bhadranu Pashyantu. So that there is, let everyone be happy, everyone be prosperous, let no one suffer any pain, and then we say Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So 3 times we say, let peace be inner peace, outer peace, and universal peace. So our whole concept of religion is based on larger good of the society. So when we go to a temple, we say let everyone be blessed in the universe, and let everyone be blessed in the world, let everyone be blessed in the country. So they don't even teach us to pray for the self, and the whole concept is getting ingrained so much that when Nepal had a problem, economic crisis, or Sri Lanka had an economic crisis, so when other countries go there and build ports or infrastructure, they almost make them write the rest of the country as a security. India doesn't do it. India has gone through the pain itself, and it realizes that the real friend is one who will come handy during the painful time. So it not only provides economic support, it provided food, it provided oil without any strings attached. And this is not just the SAARC countries. If you look at when we figured out how to make medicine for the COVID, before even India started giving full to all its citizens, simultaneously it started exporting for as a grant to African countries, Brazil and other countries which needed it. And it became a big political controversy, but the leadership still continued to support the countries it has promised to support. So I think what one has to look at, that the people who engage with India at a deeper level, they don't have these fears. And any country which is growing and which has 1.4 billion people, you will have good, bad and uglies. But look at when my classmates here, I ask them what is their biggest worry. They say if my kid will come home safe from the school. And India, you ask any parent, like we have poor people living on the divider also. But you won't find a single incidence of they harassing anyone, any incidence of mugging, any incidence of violence. And that's largely to do with the concept of karma. And I've interviewed many people, I like to talk to them, and they say that if they do bad karma in this life, again they will be born beggar. So people don't think of one life. So they think about, we believe in life after death, and we think about multi-life. So country whose value system is multi-generational and where the karma is so ingrained in the society that even though the biggest poverty and biggest successful, like we have the richest, probably top 5 richest person is from India. And we have probably one of the poorest population also in India in some parts. But still the crime rates are the lowest. If you go per capita, we will have lowest. And if you look at the satisfaction level, if it's done by a New York university, they will say that happiness index, we are 100. But if you go and talk to people, they are satisfied because they have been taught that whatever have you got, if it's as per your desire, then you are blessed. And if it's you didn't get what you wanted, it's God's desire. So in both the scenario, you are happy. And with this, and this is what we are taught from the childhood. And that's why when you raise this flag that if there is a concern, I will share another incident. I was in Switzerland in Davos, and our Prime Minister delivered a lecture, and the whole feeling was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole universe is one large family. And after his speech and all, I was standing there and we all clapped for him. And while we were walking, the Swiss president stopped me. And he later on interviewed me for half an hour saying, do you guys really believe this, or this is just a bullshit which your prime minister is talking to impress all of us? So he couldn't even relate that a country's head, instead of asking for investment, sitting in the World Economic Forum and delivering a speech on culture, values, and what is very important to India as a nation. So my sense is that the reason India is attracting investment, despite the challenges, and there was a period where it was known as ease of doing business, we are not great, and all of that, the opportunity is humongous. And India, like my friend was saying, we have created 100 plus unicorn, having 330 billion valuation in a span of less than 10 years. Mm-hmm. That has given world confidence that India has good entrepreneurs. It will follow processes. It's a country which is ruled by regulation. The court is very effective. And when they invest in India, they will be rewarded economically as well. So all of this combined is making India's story stronger.
So that's great to hear. But let me ask you differently. Tanvi, how open should India be to these kind of investments? And also, we were talking outside, Anuj, there has been a lot of unicorns that have come up from India. There's probably second to US, the number of people who are in AI, for example. Mm-hmm. But a lot of folks have built those unicorns in the Silicon Valley and then returned to India often. So the question, two ways. One, how much investment and how open should Indian economy be if it were to survive? Because there are always some negatives associated with things like that. And on the other hand, what can India offer the world in terms of these kind of companies that they may be actually exporting? versus taking from Silicon Valley to India?
Well, actually, let me clear that misnomer. Most Indian unicorns were actually created by people who grew up in India. So the statistics that you actually quoted is not true.
Okay.
Right. So I mean, I happen to be a Silicon Valley grad, and went back home and sort of.
So I was not saying that the statistics. I was saying there was a lot of people who have created these unicorns even in Silicon Valley and have returned to India. Now the question is, are we exporting some of those? Now are we creating unicorns in India and are actually becoming globally influential?
Yeah. So I think, like India probably is having its China moment from a reverse, talented labor migration. So you could argue that throughout the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of my friends who actually kind of worked with many people in the investment space. They actually went to China at that point in time and did many cool things. But actually at the same time, the homegrown local Chinese entrepreneurs were actually outstanding, and they built some phenomenal companies, right? Jack Ma didn't really work in Silicon Valley. He kind of built Alibaba all the while in China. Or at the same time, Sachin and Binny, who were the founders of Flipkart, they actually didn't really work in Silicon Valley. They built the damn company right out there in Bangalore, and eventually, some say it's actually $100 billion, $50 billion, who knows? But it's a fantastic example and illustration of the fact that I think what you're probably trying to say is, Anuj, that there is something about the American institution of entrepreneurship which really helps. And I think to its credit, whether it was the early migration from India into the Valley and so forth and so on, and its subsequent return and collaboration and participation, I think that culture of entrepreneurship somehow organically grew in India, which is outstanding. Because my fervent belief is that you cannot grow entrepreneurship. It just happens. Like, I mean, nobody thought that Silicon Valley or Bay Area will become the hotbed of innovation and so forth and so on. And no matter what happens, but Bangalore had to become what it became. So, as I say, it's kind of like it takes three fools to actually drive innovation. Somebody who actually leaves a great job or a great career to start something. The other one who actually decides to fund that idea, and the third one who actually decides to try it, like whether you work for them or you try them. So it's interesting now, how the hell do you make sure that these three organic emotions come together to actually fuel entrepreneurship? That actually started happening in Bangalore in the same way that it actually started happening in the Valley, a few decades ago. So I think that is amazing. Now, which means that as long as the Indian entrepreneur, as long as the Indian investor deeply understands what is the playbook that they will actually export to the world, right? And I really believe that the next ChatGPT may not be born in India, because ChatGPT needs the kind of theoretical computer science and sort of understanding of whatever ChatGPT is about. And a lot of that talent really may have actually gone out from India and still is in the universities out here. But I think what India is unbelievable and amazing at is actually understanding and identifying the various illustrations and use cases of those kind of technologies. So you will see massive amount of workflow automation platforms get created. How do you actually use innovations such as OpenAI, ChatGPT, and so forth and so on to actually improve productivity of humans, such that the overall experience that is provided at the least economic sort of cost. Those are things that actually work brilliantly in India. Mm-hmm. And I think those ideas, or B2B e-commerce ideas, those are the ones that will actually travel far and wide. And I think I'm good friends with a lot of entrepreneurs, good friend with a lot of investors, and I think the right ones have actually started to figure it out. And you'll actually start seeing so many examples of great Indian entrepreneurs and ideas establish their companies, I think, in what I say India and India-like markets, and then subsequently some will actually break out and create fantastic ideas and companies that will show up all over the world.
Great.
Just to add, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just to add one point on that, if you really look at a few years back, it was like Vineet mentioned, people were happy with whatever is there, but today they are happy but not satisfied, right? So they always look at opportunity globally, right? If I was doing something in India, I was very happy doing because it's a large market and I can play and so on and so forth. But today it's not the case. Yeah. Today we look at global as an opportunity. And the good thing is that when you're partnering with investors, let's say here in US or other parts of the world, they also kind of collaborate and say, okay, how can we take this globally and rather than focus only on India? When I started in 2015, I saw India as a big opportunity and I said I'll do only in India. But today we operate in Asia, in Middle East, and looking at investing now, starting in US and others. That mindset change has happened really fast over last years, right? And that is what is driving this collaboration in my mind.
Yeah.
And let me connect that to the point about kind of openness. And I suspect I might have a different answer than maybe the Indian government would have on the openness question, but I'll make the case for it. And I'll make the case for it partly connected to this point about, especially younger folks and entrepreneurs. I actually think, and I grew up in socialist India in the 80s, and I saw the change. There was a wave of liberalization in the early 90s forced upon India by a balanced payments crisis. I saw the change, and I'll tell you the difference, which is I do think people, there was you had a new idea, and you'd go there, and then people would list the 5 reasons why it wasn't possible, if you had any kind of new idea. I'll tell you the difference, and you feel it talking to younger people. I don't think they're satisfied, and I think that's a good thing. They're hungry. Mm-hmm. They're hungry, they're driven, there's a mood, they want change. There are between the age of 18 and 35, you asked about uniqueness of India. 18 to 35-year-olds, 600 million, right? These are people who could either be that demographic dividend, but you had to skill them, you had to get them jobs, because otherwise that turns into a demographic disaster pretty quickly. I don't think India can achieve that without openness. And I think the attitude needs to be not what will the world do to India, which was the fear many years, what can the world do for India? Yeah. And what can India and the world do with each other? Because I don't think you can have this as just homegrown. And I think that's why I said it cannot be self-sufficiency in terms of self-reliance. It has to be resilience. It has to be how are you doing these things with the world. And I'll give you an example of how openness can benefit India and with partners. And this is not just about the US or investment from the US. You're seeing it from the Middle East. I think there was a Saudi minister the other day who pointed out, they're very bullish on India in terms of capital. And this is where, India looking for China alternatives has meant, you saw this in the tech sector, where there was a concern when India said, we don't want any more Chinese investment in tech. You saw that go down, and people were fearful that there wouldn't be capital. India had kind of a bumper year after that, 2 years record capital from the West and from the Middle East coming in. So I think the examples I'll give you is, 9 universities, there was a 9 university consortium from the US that in the 50s and 60s helped set up the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. It was the first computer science program in the country. Today, a graduate, not only are they graduates of various kind of CEOs in various companies, the India's IT and electronics minister is from that university. Space. There's a kind of a view that this is all self-sufficient, India's space program. Today, there are kind of commercial space startups in India working with the US Defense Department and doing projects for them. They're small. They have nothing to do with government. They're working on their own across boundaries. Now, this is thought of as, this was unique. But this was a combination. It was the Indian government investing in universities and science in STEM fields, but it was also early collaboration between India's Space Agency and NASA. And so there is all this potential for India to do more at a time. It is this moment that has this geopolitical side where other countries want to help India. So I'll just say one more thing, which is you have former foreign secretaries of India who are China specialists saying, who understand. They said, you have sometimes in India a sense that, the thing India should learn from China is be more centralized, be more kind of, autocratic, those kind of things, look as democracies. So that's not the lesson. The lesson is do what China did in the 80s, which is use the opportunity, the moment on the 90s to actually grow. And I think India can do it differently from China and can do it in a more open way.
I really like that. I think that's the right way to sort of think about it. We were talking about the same thing in the context of what happened in Singapore and how LKY sort of grew that amazing nation. And I think that the two things that are interesting is there's so much energy when you actually visit that country, so much young energy, and I think that's expecting more to happen. that's a moment in time. And I think the other thing that you think, which is also fairly interesting, is that this circle of trust, which you could argue includes Australia, Japan, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Western Europe, US, vis-a-vis India's opportunity, is actually emerging. It's there for everybody to see. I think the advent of those two is the opportunity at this point in time.
So great, and you can see it on Vineet's smile as well, that whole part as well. But let me actually.
I just wanted to add another point which getting ignored. We have 650 million people in villages, and the level of grid they have is unparalleled. None of the sons or daughters living in the city will have same level of grid. They want to change their lifestyle for good, and they are leaving no stone unturned to achieve their dream. So if you look at the toppers who appear from the IITs, which is the best institute, or Indian Institute of Science, or the best doctors, they are no more coming from the metros. They are coming from the places which was called hinterland, or places which were called where there was no toilets 15 years back, or no education access. And that grade no school can teach. I think the biggest challenge for the metro school is, when I talk to them, is that how do I teach grit to these guys? They are bright, they are good at presenting, but what they don't have is they give up at single failure. And whereas those kids fall every day, get up and run again. And they are the one who is going to change India for good.
Great. So let me bring it back to a couple of questions that might be worth talking about overall. One, what are the biggest risks for regenerative AI as it pertains to Indian society? And and also I want us to think a little bit about what you mentioned earlier on Vineet. India is not just wanting to be an economic power, but also in some ways wants to be a spiritual leader in the world. And the messaging that's in a sense, it wants to be the world guru of spirituality, right? And there is, in that promotion of that, what translates into world is one family, is that something which is resonating with the world? So think about the connection with regenerative AI and how it impacts the Indian society, and then talk a little bit about how this, this status of spiritual leader in the world, how is that being resonating in the world?
So I can go first.
Sure.
I think I was just wondering, being two tech founders, you're not asking anything on GI and other things. So when is that going to happen? So thanks for that.
Yeah. This is your chance.
Yeah. So I think it's the same for anywhere in the world, right? Whether it's going to be positive or negative. But if you look at the opportunity that GI throws right now, talk about skilling. If you have to skill 1.4 billion people with a school system, you cannot, right? India has a mobile penetration, which is unbelievable, right? 85% of the people have a smartphone. And if you can build a system on GI and skill everyone for the world, this is going to change. So I think the important thing, like Anuj said, is the use cases are massive, and that is where the focus are. But of course, there are negative sides as well, which we have to be cognizant of, and no one knows what's going to happen with all the things that we are reading around. And on the spiritual side, I think as long as you keep yourself healthy, it's fine. I mean, why should you bother anything else? It's one life, just enjoy as much as we can.
I think one thing to add to the question that you actually asked, which so I have some personal experience in that field, and actually Eric Schmidt, who used to be my past CEO, was actually kind of talking about it, and I really agree, is that regenerative AI, generative AI, and so forth and so on, the world doesn't really know where these things are actually headed. Like any platform shifts, they will take a life of their own, some good, some not so, and we learn. But I think as a society, because the internet has been so transformative and the obsolescence cycle is so short, that we are still learning how to deal with the internet, and here comes this new thing. So I think at some level, there has to be some governance framework around it, which actually allows for trusted, safe, usage of such sort of technologies. And this I say with the fact that I'm myself a technology, child of the technology world and went to the IITs that you talked about. And so I really love the fact that there's so much innovation. But at the same time, I think there has to be some broad governance framework that needs to be established. And one thing that I actually really, love and admire was all the large sort of Silicon Valley platforms at some point in time actually came together, and there's so much push on them, is to make sure that the consumer, who's actually really at the center of this, the user who's at the center of it, is really got the power to choose, has the information that is transparently available to them, and they should know how their data and their life is sort of being utilized. As long as those things and that framework is there, you can argue that these kind of technologies can actually shape humanities in unbelievable ways. And we learn what those use cases will be. But I think that's where a lot of help is needed, especially in very large countries like India, wherein this, with the 70% mobile penetration, could actually spark a revolution one way or the other. Right? So, yeah.
Just to add to that, there's a lot of social media active world in India now, right?
For good and bad.
And good and bad, right?
Yeah.
And if there is a fake narrative getting created and fake thing, and that could change on the negative side, and that's where the governance model becomes very, very crucial.
So I think regenerative AI and spirituality has a great connect.
I thought you would say that. That's why I wanted to ask that question.
So I'm going to give you guys a business idea to implement, which US is able to do. So use the regenerative AI and use augmented and virtual reality. The biggest problem I hear from people here is the sleep. And our saints and yogis, they can go into Yog Nidra at any place. Means you can do yogic breathing and you could be in trance technically. So if I can actually fire your neuron and use neuroplasticity to create the illusion that you are in the bliss and in the situation of eternal bliss, you will start feeling blissful. And that is what could be probably the India's contribution, that we bring the concept of Soham, which is using spirituality as a means of holistic medicine, not using the medicine per se to fix the problem, because the body has ability to generate all the hormones, all the energy what it needs. It just needs the right methodology to generate them instead of using an external stimulant. So I think that could be an India's gift to the world if we can combine all these newer technology to solve some of the major challenges of humanity and provide it at the lowest cost to everyone to use. I think that would transform the world to a better place to live.
Including Livspace and better place. These are the other two gifts.
Just very quickly, I don't know about kind of AI and spirituality, but in terms of STEM, and I'll bring in another S, which is the importance of social science and bringing it and marrying that. Partly because I don't just say this as a social scientist. My first job, I was telling these guys earlier, was as a coder in Bangalore. So I do have that kind of STEM side. But it goes to the governance point. Right now, we're having a situation where when we're having these discussions, and these are, again, discussions, for example, the Quad is talking about AI standards, quantum computing, things like that. But the thing is, you can't bring social scientists to understand societies, to understand kind of impact at the end of the process. You can't create these things and then leave and say, oh my God, what have I created? I don't want to be another Oppenheimer. You need to bring in people in the start. And this is true of doing kind of business in India or thinking about India, which is not just thinking about it as a tech opportunity or manufacturing, but understanding kind of Indian politics, economics, the kind of center state dimensions, the kind of local realities and where they work. So I think, thinking about India not as just kind of from a STEM side, but a social science side as well.
Great. So from all this conversation, and with 1 minute remaining, I want to kind of summarize and say lots of opportunities in India in many ways. People are very happy. There is joy, if I'm hearing it correctly, and not satisfied at the same time. There's a huge spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship. A lot of investment going into India. So one of the things as an educator, I want to ask the final question here to leave you with is, for all of this, the higher education system in India needs to continue to evolve, right? And it has been. A lot of universities have come up. But I want to hear a little bit about your thoughts on how are they doing and what can be done or what should be done in terms of the higher education system in India?
I mean, I can give you a 10-second answer, given that I went to some of those places myself. I think there's a huge opportunity for IITs and IIMs and BITSs and all these other great universities to perhaps make their sort of curriculum and curricular infrastructure one level more relevant for today's world, right? And this I'm saying as I hire a lot of talent in India and so forth and so on. So I think that would be a request to gods who are running these kind of places. I think secondly, there's a huge opportunity in terms of sort of two vectors. One is I think learning is a lifelong opportunity. And I think if we can actually invest heavily in creating infrastructures wherein you can teach someone how to learn, like learning to learn is a significant skill that needs to be invested in, which I think is the opportunity for these kind of places. And I think the second thing which is very, very interesting is that the new areas, whether it's climate technology or climate APIs or B2B or AI or generative, all of these 20 buzzwords that we've just talked about, all of this will need a certain class of talent. So as long as universities can backward integrate and make sure that today's kid who's actually kind of going there is really aware of what this means, what are the various opportunities, and has the innovation and sort of infrastructure, the curious infrastructure to learn these things, I think the world is our oyster.
Well, thank you very much for a lovely session. It was really enjoyable talking to you all here. And please, let's give them a round of applause here. Thank you very much. And thanks for attending the session.